Okay, so we're going to be talking about today Mark 9, verses 2 to 9, which is the story of Jesus's transfiguration. And it pairs very nicely with the preceding scene where Jesus foretells his death and resurrection at the end of Mark chapter 8, and the text that I'll preach on the 22nd, which is Peter's declaration about Jesus. So from chapter 8, verse 27 through to chapter 9, verse 9, it's broken into three pieces in my particular text, in my particular version, but all three of these scenes go together because they carry this theme of the Messiah through each of them, and indeed function as a turning point in the Gospel of Mark. So last week I talked about so Mark 9 is for May 29th, and it'll be the final chapter that we look at in this section of our journey through the Gospel of Mark. So we're going to kind of end on the high point in the first half of the Gospel of Mark, and then when we come back in the fall, then we will follow what this messianic declaration that Peter makes and this transfiguration moment means for the rest of the gospel. And so basically we're stopping at the midpoint of the gospel for this section. So on the 22nd, I'll talk about Jesus and him asking the question of his disciples of who do people say that I am, and then who do you say that I am? And Peter declares on behalf of all the disciples that you are the Messiah, the Christ, the anointed one. And then beginning in verse 31 and going through the end of the chapter, in chapter 8, Jesus begins to tell the disciples about what kind of Messiah he really is. So he begins to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said this all quite openly, and then Peter takes him aside and begins to rebuke him. I talked about this last week, but in verse 33, Jesus turns and looks at his disciples, and he rebukes Peter. He says, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He's telling Peter that he doesn't understand the kind of Messiah that Jesus is going to be. So Peter has made the correct proclamation of who Jesus is. He just doesn't understand the kind of Messiah, the kind of anointed one that Jesus will be. And so he says, so then he begins in verse 34 to talk about the cost of discipleship. He says, if any want to be my followers, let them deny themselves, take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And then he says in chapter 9, verse 1, and he said to them, again to the disciples and to those gathered around, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see that the kingdom of God has come with power. So this is the lead up to the transfiguration story, and it is Jesus explaining to his disciples and to the crowd what kind of Messiah he will be. And we've seen already that from the very outset of the gospel. So we go back to the very first verse in the Gospel of Mark. It's Mark tells us this is the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. So he calls him Jesus Christ, Jesus the Messiah, Jesus the Anointed One, and the Son of God. Later on in the chapter, 10 verses later, in verse 11 of chapter 1, at the baptism of Jesus, the voice from heaven says, "You are my Son, the beloved, with you I am well pleased." And then we see even the evil spirits begin to proclaim who Jesus is, and they so the man with the unclean spirit calls Jesus the Holy One of God, and there are several other places where Jesus is truly identified, but he's identified by demons. He's identified by people, by spirits who are not of this world. And so this is the first time where someone proclaims that Jesus is the Messiah, and puts that Anointed One name on him. But even though, so this is a high moment in 27 to 30, but then there's a low moment in 31 to 33 where Jesus rebukes Peter because he misunderstands, and then he tries to help the misunderstanding. And again, this leads into the transfiguration story. So this is Mark 9, and it's verses 2 to 9. So I'll read that in its entirety. So Mark writes, 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain apart by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his clothes became dazzling white, such as no one on earth could bleach them. And there appeared to them Elijah with Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Then Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say, for they were terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and from the cloud there came a voice. "This is my Son, the beloved. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, he ordered them to tell no one about what they had seen until after the Son of Man had risen from the dead. All right. So we have Peter making the proclamation of who Jesus is as the Messiah. The misunderstanding by that same man, by Peter, about what kind of Messiah that Jesus will be. And now we see this transfiguration moment where Peter and James and John, I call them the big 3, get to go with Jesus up to the top of Mount Hermon, which is up north near Caesarea Philippi, and he goes up there, and they see Jesus changed in form. So this idea of transfiguration is this transformation. He's the word in the original language is the word that we get for metamorphosis. And so he's transfigured, he's transformed, his appearance has changed. And it's done right in front of them. And his clothes become dazzling white. This idea is that they are shining, exceedingly white. They are glistening or flashing or radiant. And so anyway, it's almost blinding how white the clothes become. And then the NRSV says, "Such as no one on earth can bleach them." The word is to whiten. So bleach is sort of an NRSV accommodation of what it is. Bleach didn't exist back then. It was so it was the word of making it white. So I guess bleach existed, but I don't know if it was a common household product. And so the first thing that happens is that Jesus is transfigured, and his clothes are dazzling white. And then verse 4 says, Elijah and Moses appear, and they're having conversation with Jesus. And so Elijah is one of the most influential prophets of the Old Testament that doesn't actually have a book named after him. You can read about him in First Kings. And then there's Moses, obviously, who brought down the law. And so there's a couple of things that tie Moses and Elijah and Jesus together in this moment. And one of them is a mountain. Moses goes up Mount Sinai to get the Ten Commandments and the law and the Torah. Elijah goes up the mountain when he is running away from Bathsheba and Ahab, and encounters God in the still small voice. And now Jesus is on a mountain, and there will be a voice that appears or that comes out of this cloud that will appear in just a minute, and so all three of them go up on a mountain. All three of them have this cloud experience, and all three of them hear the voice of the Lord speaking to them in this moment. So in this transfiguration scene, we have Moses, who represents the law. We have Elijah, who represents the prophets, and we have Jesus, who represents the fulfillment of both the law and the prophets in the Messiah that is the true Messiah, the Messiah that people have yet to fully understand, but that Mark will continue to unpack through the rest of his gospel. As with many things that seem otherworldly, divine in nature, Peter and the disciples are speechless. They're confused. They're surprised. They're fearful. So Peter says the very first thing that comes out of his mouth, and basically it says, "It's good for us to be here. We're in a great spot. So let's try to hold on to this." So he says, "Well, let me build you a tabernacle. I'll build you a tabernacle, Jesus. I'll build Elijah a tabernacle, and we'll build Moses a tabernacle, and we'll hang out here, and we'll stay on the mountaintop." And he says this because he doesn't know what else to say, and he's terrified. He's full of fear. So then, and I had to, when I read this, I went in my previous readings of this text, I always thought that the cloud comes right at the beginning. As soon as Jesus is transfigured, or as Jesus is being transfigured, the cloud shows up. But it's not until verse 7 that the cloud shows up. So in verse 7, the cloud overshadows them. So it covers them up like a fog kind of deal. And from the cloud, there comes a voice, and the voice of the Lord that says, "This is my son, my beloved. Listen to him." Now, this is a callback to Jesus' baptismal scene in chapter 1. This is the idea of a cloud overshadowing. Again, calls back to Elijah and his encounter with God on the mountain, and Moses and his encounter with God on the mountain. And so, but the phrase, the sentence of "This is my son, the beloved, listen to him," this is a direct callback to Jesus' baptismal scene as he's coming up out of the water. So this cloud is here. You hear the voice, and then Mark switches again to suddenly, when they looked around, they saw no one with them anymore, but only Jesus. And depending on which commentary you read, this can signify a couple of things. One is that now this moment where only Jesus remains is this fulfillment or a visual representation of Jesus being the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. So therefore, Moses and Elijah are no longer on the scene. It's just Jesus, and everything's been encapsulated into him. Others think of it as just because the word of the Lord is listened to him, to Jesus, that the others aren't necessary anymore. But whatever happens, it's just Jesus and the big three, Peter, James, and John, that are left on top of the mountain. And my understanding, as I visualize this scene, is that the cloud is still there. The cloud hasn't lifted yet. But then they come down, verse 9, they come down off the mountain, and Jesus orders them to tell no one about what they had seen until, and this is usually when Jesus gives an order for, secrecy, for don't tell anybody, he doesn't put a time limit on it. But this time he does. The second half of verse 9 says, until after the Son of Man has risen from the dead. And because we see this with post-Easter eyes and post-resurrection eyes, we go, oh, okay, I can see that. And then we immediately jump to Easter morning. We jump to the book of Acts and them proclaiming things about Jesus. But in this moment, they're wondering, what in the world is he talking about here? Now, if they were paying attention to what Jesus had said to them a little bit before at the end of chapter 8, they would have known what he was talking about and would have understood. But again, they don't have the benefit of hindsight like we do. And so they're living in this in the moment. And as he says, he says, I must be, and again, going back to 8:31, must undergo great suffering, be rejected by the elders and chief priests and the scribe, be killed, and after 3 days rise again. So he's calling back to what he just said about what kind of Messiah he's going to be. And so he says, don't tell anybody about what you've just seen until after the Son of Man has risen from the dead. And then if you keep going in chapter 9, you see they kept the matter to themselves, questioning, what is this rising from the dead? What does this mean? And then they asked Jesus about, why does the scribe say Elijah must come first? And he says, Elijah has come, and it's, related to John the Baptist. So then they carry on. But so there's this transfiguration scene is the culmination of this midpoint in the gospel of Mark, where Mark is transitioning from Jesus being the one who does signs and wonders, even though there will still be miracles performed in the second half of the gospel. But now he's continually going to live into and behave from the perspective of he's the Messiah, and everything else, everything that happens from this point forward moves the needle on that identity, so that at the foot of the cross, as Jesus breathes his last, the Roman centurion looks up at him and says, truly, this is the Son of God. So everything from this moment forward is pushing for Jesus's identity as the Messiah. And even in the midst of people misunderstanding what that really means and how that's really going to come about. So, okay. I'm going to take a drink of my tea and give you a chance to gather any questions that you might have.
Is the transfiguration similar to the resurrection? Like, that, in the transfiguration, I know, his clothes become exceedingly white and shining. But at the resurrection, Mary did not recognize him. So, I'm assuming that there was some physical change that maybe that she didn't recognize him. So is this similar or not? Not really.
So it has similarities to it. It's not the same thing. Yes, I think it feels like the transfiguration is, while it's talking about a change in appearance, that's, from the original language, that's the word they're trying to use. There's an emphasis here on his clothes changing, not necessarily his physical appearance, like his face or body or whatever. The resurrection is a specific act that is a dead body that has come back to life. That is not what's happening here. And yes, John records that as Mary is in grief at the tomb, you can go there, it's John 20. Let's see. So verse 11, Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and as she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb, and she saw two angels. They said to her, "Why are you weeping?" And she said to them, "They have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him." When she said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she did not know that it was Jesus. And then Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you looking for?" Supposing him to be the gardener, so she thought he was, John is very specific about where the tomb is. It's a garden tomb. So the gardener would be there to take care of the grounds. She says, "Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away." And Jesus says to her, "Mary," and it's in the speaking of her name that she recognizes him. So yes, I think there is something that has, it's either her grief or the not yet comprehending of him being alive that mixes together here in the Gospel of John, that she doesn't recognize him. Now, that seems, for me, that's kind of, I would need to dig a little further into that to understand a little bit more, because, Mary is there, she's attested that, 7 demons were cast out of her, and that she sat at his feet and learned from him and traveled with him, along with the other disciples. So she would have known his physical appearance quite well. So I think there's something else going on in this moment that may be similar to the Emmaus Road story, where where Cleopas and his friend are kept from recognizing Jesus until the breaking of the bread. So in the moment that the bread is broken, they recognize him, and then Jesus disappears. Here, it's in speaking of her name that she recognizes him, and then he tells her to go and tell the others, and she goes. So I think there's something like that going on here. And not that he's, obviously he's risen from the dead. His broken and beaten body that she last saw looks whole and complete again. Most of our depictions of it are outside of the fact that he would have holes in his hands and in his feet, and then the piercing in his side. As the scars to remind us of those wounds. So I think there's something like that going on there. But I think, again, there's more at work in the transfiguration scene and in that resurrection scene than just what our eyes can behold.
I guess I always just assumed, I guess I kind of missed that one line in verse 10. I guess I always assumed it was just a vision of Elijah and Moses, but the disciples, they says questioning what the rising from the dead meant. So does that kind of mean that it was actually Moses and Elijah, that not just a vision, but the actually appearance there?
So it could be that. I mean, they'll go on to talk about if you keep reading, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? And he equates. He doesn't say this directly, but what Jesus is inferring by saying Elijah is indeed coming first to restore all things, and that in verse 13 Elijah has come. He's talking about John the Baptist, and so there's this, because again, if you jump back to chapter 8, and the declaration that they're making, so Jesus asked the question, who do people say that I am? And they say Elijah, or one of the prophets, or John the Baptist. So there's to say that Jesus is a prophet, or to say that Jesus is someone of that nature, is not entirely wrong. It's just not completely right. But what it is saying is that if Jesus is a reincarnation, so to speak, of Elijah or one of the other prophets, or even John the Baptist, then it's a denial of who Jesus truly is as the Son of God, and that he's if he is one of those people, a prophet or Elijah or even John the Baptist, that he's then still a precursor to the Messiah that is to come. So then he pushes farther on, who do you say that I am? And then Peter answers that you're the Messiah. And Matthew goes farther to say, to add on that you're the Son of the living God. We talked about that last week. And so that's so it's not wrong necessarily to say that Jesus is a prophet or a teacher, or a good moral example. It's just not complete. My theology professor in seminary would say that it's as good as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. It's this, there's still more that you need to add, or more that you need to understand about it. And so that's when Jesus, so in the very next verse, verse 31, he starts adding more to the equation by explaining what kind of Messiah he will be. And again, in the transfiguration, then they begin to see that God is now affirming, yes, he is my son, the beloved. Listen to him. He's the one you need to listen to. He's the one you need to focus your energy on. And so again, it's that pivot point in the gospel, moving the action towards the cross.
Well, and as you said, that he's really the fulfillment of both the law and the prophets. So he is a prophet, but he's, it's like you said, he's more than that. So he's a combination of both Moses and Elijah and what they brought to the history of the people.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if you're familiar with the Bible Project. It's they're a nonprofit that's community funded, but they do a podcast and they do videos.
It's like an illustrated.
Yeah, the illustrated. Yeah. And they had they're working through the book of Exodus right now, I believe. But they were talking about how that there is this the understanding of the law and the prophets are like, they're talking about there was the covenant that God made with Adam, and and that was perfect, and that was good, and that was the way that it was supposed to be. And then Adam broke that, and so there was separation. And so then the Mosaic covenant, or the Abraham covenant comes in, and then you're going to restore through the people. And then that worked in part, and then didn't. And then the Mosaic covenant comes in and tries to set up this system of people making sacrifices to make things right with them and God. And that works as far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough until Jesus comes. And Jesus is the one who fulfills all of those covenants and sets us back right the way that we were originally created. They say it way more eloquently than I just did, and for like an hour on that podcast. But it's this sense that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Mosaic covenant. He is the prophet who proclaims the word of God, and then is the perfect sacrifice to atone for our sins and to restore us to right relationship with God. And that's sort of starting to be encapsulated right here. And then again, the attention starts moving towards the cross.
What was the mountain that Elijah went up on that you mentioned?
I think it was Mount Horeb, which is the same one that Moses went up on, or Mount Horeb and Sinai are interchangeable. They're the same mountain.
Okay. That was interesting. I hadn't thought about that the three of them went up on mountains and had that, the cloud experience.
Yeah. And all heard the voice of God. And one of the things that sticks with, so this doesn't happen with Elijah, but Moses and Jesus, Moses in Exodus, and Jesus here in the Transfiguration, they have this dazzling experience. So when Moses comes down from the mountain, and after meeting with God, he has to put a veil over his face because the people can't look at him because he's shining so brightly after having met with God. And then his glory, the glory fades after a while, and he has to go back up the mountain. And anyway, but in Jesus, again, Jesus here has his dazzling white clothes. And then his ultimate glorification as he ascends to heaven and sits at the right hand of the Father is that eternal shining that happens. So, and if I remember correctly, then when he comes when he returns in the second coming, then he comes, in that glory as well. I haven't read Revelation in a while, so I think that's right. I will leave that to be wrong if I need to be wrong, if I am wrong in that moment. And just as we'll pick back up, Mark, in probably late August, early September, but this the end of chapter 8, this Jesus foretelling his death and resurrection, is just the first time of 3 times that he will foretell his death and resurrection. And the next one happens later in chapter 9, verses 30 to 32. That's the second time. And what happens is, so Jesus foretells his death and resurrection the first time, and then he teaches about discipleship in 34 to 38. So then Jesus foretells his death and resurrection in 9:30 to 32. And then he teaches about who's the greatest, because they're having this argument. The disciples are having this argument about who's the greatest. And so he talks about, okay, I'm going to teach you about who is the greatest. And then I believe and then in the end of towards the end of chapter 10, Jesus, they're going up to Jerusalem, and he takes them aside, and they tells them again that he's going to be killed, and then he's going to rise. And then immediately following that, James and John want to be at his right and left hands, and when he comes in glory. And so he teaches again about what it truly means to follow, what it means to be great, what it means to, he says, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. For the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So, and all three of those predictions or declarations about his death and resurrection happen before he gets to Jerusalem, because chapter 11 opens with his triumphal entry. We go right into Holy Week. And so Mark spends 6 chapters of his 16 chapters talking about Holy Week and Easter. So anyway, so we'll come back to that at the end of August. We'll do chapters 10 and 11, probably we may revisit chapter 9 and go into chapter 10.
What's the summer plans?
So we're going to do the Lord's Prayer.
Oh, that's right. I remember you saying
Yeah.
that.
So I have 5 books that I'm going to read in the next few weeks, getting ready for that. So I'm going to we'll take next week off because we're already ahead. We're already finished with this series. So we won't have a video session next week, but then we'll be back on the final week of May to get ready. So let's see, today's the 18th, right? Yeah. So we'll be back on the 1st to talk about, start talking about the Lord's Prayer. And the way I'm going to structure it is the first week is going to be sort of this intro to the whole Lord's Prayer before we dive in over the following weeks to it. So that way I can get some resources into the congregation's hands about the Lord's Prayer, and some resources that I want to give to them so that they can engage fully that first full week of June, and so they won't be like behind. So anyway, so we won't meet next week, but we'll meet again on the 1st, and we'll start talking about the Lord's Prayer. And I will email you guys that, number one, that information about not meeting next week, but then also the book list in case you're interested in any of those resources. The one when we did Psalm 23 2 summers ago, Philip Keller did the Shepherd looks at Psalm 23. So he's written a book called A Layman's Look at the Lord's Prayer. So it's the same guy that wrote that Shepherd's Look at Psalm 23. And so so this is one of the books. And we're going to look at, so just because there's 2 versions of the Lord's Prayer in our scriptures, we're going to be focusing on the Matthew version of it. Matthew 6, 9-13 is the text. And I'll make reference in that first sermon to Luke's version, because the name of the series is Lord Teach Us to Pray, which actually occurs in Luke, not in Matthew. But we're going to dive into the Matthew text because it's more close, because the version. So anyway, both versions are slightly different in Matthew and Luke, and they're also different than the one that we normally say in worship, because there's pieces that have been added to it and ways that we've changed it over the course of the years. So again, I'll talk about all of that in that first lesson, in that first message about this. But our main text will be Matthew 6, 9-13. Very good.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks for jumping on. And if you need anything, just let me know and we'll go from there. Thanks so much, Gail. Take
Okay,
care.
bye.